This video is about Pitsu, who was stepfather to my mother Dot, and then grandfather to a whole tribe of us Baileys, Cilliers, Curries and Hobsons. Piet from about 1910 farmed just south of Priska on a farm called Nelspoortjie. And he was a wonderful grandfather in that he would regale us with stories from the farm, and particularly with stories about jackal hunts from the farm. Before we get to the details of the life of Piet Cilliers, we need to place him within the larger Cilliers family in South Africa. The first Cilliers to arrive from France in 1700 was a man called Oupa Cilliers, and they settled in the Drakensberg area. And I won't go into all the detail of the generations as they came down, but in the third generation, a man called Abraham Suier was born in 1805 in Klein Drakensberg. When he was still quite a little boy, in about 1810, the family moved from there and they came to Graaff-Reinet. They settled on a farm called Blaukrans, which if you take the road to New Bethesda and you turn off to go past Rietfontein to go past Stugstern, it's the next farm. It's a farm that now belongs to the Derksons, I believe. So that was their first home in Graaff-Reinet. That was Abraham's and all of his siblings. That's where they settled. The older brother to Abraham was a man that I think is very well known in South African history, and he was Cyril Cilliers, who was spiritual leader of the Voortrekkers, and the man who, together with Andries Pretorius, was involved at the Battle of Blood River. Cyril was the one who stood on top of a gun carriage and spoke courage to the Boers, and he was the one who uttered the words of the vow. He vocalized their collective commitment to God to always remember that day and honor him if he were to give them victory. And at the conclusion of the Battle of Blood River, he was also one of the people who was instrumental in the project in Pietermaritzburg where they got to build the Church of the Vow. So that was the older brother of Abraham. We are looking at the life of Abraham Suier because he was the grandfather of Piet, who is the subject of this video. Abraham, he was in this family. They farmed at Blaukrans, but the farm was sold, and Abraham moved further north, somewhere into the Agtersneuberg, where he owned a farm. And when he was farming there, he had the first 5 of his children between 1827 and 1839 in the Agtersneuberg. And then his first wife died, and his next wife gave him 8 children. They appear to have moved from Agtersneuberg to Colesberg for a while, and then after that in 1848 they moved to Richmond in the Northern Cape. And his second wife also died, and then his third wife Maria gave him 3 children, and the middle child of those 3 was Petrus Stephanus Cilliers, and he was born on the 15th of May 1862. And Petrus Stephanus is the father of Piet. Petrus Stephanus, when he reached adulthood, he studied to be a lawyer, and he set himself up as attorney. The first 4 children that were born to Petrus Stephanus and his wife Catharina were born in Richmond. They were Francis in 1888, Gabriel Pieter in 1889, together with his twin brother Jimmy. Jimmy's full names were Abraham Jacobus in 1889, and then Petrus Stephanus, the man that we're looking at, Piet, was born in 1891. The family then appeared to have moved to Bridgetown, and Petrus Stephanus Sr. moved his practice his legal practice to Bridgetown, and the last three children were born there. In 1893, Vivian was born. In 1899, Dorothy, and then finally in 1901, Harold. So just a brief bit of history about Pieter's siblings. The eldest one, Francis, became the proprietor of the Queen's Hotel in Oudtshoorn. Gabriel lost his life in the First World War. His twin brother, Jimmy, did not make it to adulthood. He died when he was 4. And then Pieter, who we're going to talk about in his farming career. And then after him was Vivian. Vivian was an assurance manager in East London. That's how his job has been described. Dorothy also sadly died when she was only 21. And then finally Harold, who became an artillery officer and ended up being the officer commanding Southern Cape Command. And he was killed on a flight back from Walvis Bay. Some senior officers went there in 1941 to inspect defenses, and the plane flew into a mountain on the way home. So those are the siblings of Pieter. One of the earliest stories that Oupa Piet used to tell us children was dating from the Boer War. Because in Bridgetown there was a garrison of British soldiers, and these young Boer children would, when the wagon was in a place where it's not really being observed very carefully, they would climb aboard the supply wagon and by that way gain entrance to the Tommy camp, and then they would help themselves to some food, and then under cover of darkness they would escape. So that was one of the stories that he told us about. Pieter's early schooling was in Bridgetown, but in 1904 he was enrolled in Standard 5. He was enrolled at Sachs in Cape Town, and he continued his schooling career at Sachs until he was in Standard 9. And then having left school at a very young age, he must have been only 19 or 20, he bought the farm Nelspoortjie in the Prieska district. The original dwelling was typical of the farmhouses of that period. It was a flat-roofed structure, but having glass windows and wooden doors. So it was a fairly simple structure, and he lived there from around about 1910 for 14 years as a bachelor. So it was from this period that most of the stories that Oupa Piet would tell us seem to have originated. The story that I want to relate is about his pet blue crane, and he describes how this crane, he raised it from a chick. It used to sleep on the roof at night, so it would be about the yard during the day, and then at night it would perch on top of the roof. And apparently the bird was quite comical because it used to cock its head and very carefully measure the distance to the parapet, and then it would take a running start and then flap and then land up on top of the parapet and then spend the night on top of the roof and then only come down in the morning. But to get back to the jackals, jackals only really became a big problem, once livestock fencing had been put up. In the late 1800s, fences began to be erected in South Africa. Prior to that, each flock was tended by a shepherd full-time. And so the shepherd would pen the sheep at night. The shepherd himself typically would live in a rough stone hut, and the sheep would either be in a stone kraal or enclosure or in some kind of tuck kraal that had been made of whatever vegetable material was available in the area. So the sheep were allowed to help themselves to whatever grazing they wanted to and wander wherever they wanted to day and night, and therefore they were subject to predation. A well-balanced Jackal pack would have a large variety of dogs in it. They needed some small dogs to go after the Jackal if it went underground. They needed at least one windhond, something that had enough speed to chase down a Jackal. And then they needed some dogs with good noses that could follow the scent. One of the dogs that appeared to have been Oupa Piet's favorite was an Irish Terrier called Steekbaard. Steekbaard was the leader of the pack and featured centrally in most of the stories. Transport in the early days was mostly by horse and cart or by ox wagon, and it was only from around about 1920 that the first motorized transport was seen in the district. And the motorbike that Piet bought for himself was a Henderson. Now, Hendersons were really something special. They were all huge four-cylinder, four-in-line, straight-in-line motorbikes, immensely powerful and therefore fast. So he bought himself a really wonderful motorbike, and I think it was mostly used to get in and out of Prieska, but that's the motorbike that he had. And then in around about 1925, just after his marriage to Corrie, and we're going to get to that in a moment, but just after his marriage to Corrie, he bought his first motor car, which was a Chev. And you see some pictures of the Chev parked outside the house and them using the Chev to get about. Adjacent to the original farmhouse, you will see in the background a windmill with a wooden tower. So those were the early windmills that were imported. That's what they looked like. The first windmill to be imported to South Africa, let me just look it up here quickly, was a farmer called PJ du Toit who lived in Hopetown. In 1874, he bought the first windmill that came to South Africa. The early wooden towered models didn't last that long. They appear to have been superseded quite soon. And it's interesting that there's a picture featuring the wife of Peter, Corrie, sitting on her horse. And in the immediate background behind the horse, you see, first of all, the wooden towered windmill, which has now had its head removed. And then just beyond that, a windmill with a steel tower. Prior to his marriage, Piet did some improvements to his dwelling. He raised the walls and he added a pitched roof to the house. He also got hold of some dynamite and blasted a hole just in front of the veranda, and then in that hole established a garden, planted some trees. This is the frontage, the present front face of the original house that Pieter Stefanus Cilliers lived in as from 1910. You can see that there have been additional rooms added at the front and there have been wings added at the side, but the pitched roof of the main part of the house is exactly as it was in the days of Pieter Cilliers. Once the walls had been raised and the roof had been given a pitch, that's what the house looked like. And that's the original house, and then this is the scene for the guest house. In the distance there you can see the prefab house that comes from Copperton, where the current owners live. And then as you continue to put your eye westwards, there are the windmills. I don't want to go too far towards the sun, otherwise you can't see, but over there in the west are the windmills that are where most of the farming land of Nelspoortjie, where it is.
Rob, ek is Pieter Suier, eienaar van Nelspoortjie. Ons het hier in 1999 gekoop, so ons is nou al so 27 jaar hier op die plaas. As jy wel iets weet van Nelspoortjie se geskiedenis van 1880 af tot nou toe, sal ek julle presies alles vertel van die Delt familie wat eerste hier was, die Cilliers familie wat hier was, dan die Peggy wat ek geken het, haar seun, Pieter Cilliers, foto's wat ek gekry het van hom hierso, in die agtergrond, die huis wat daar so kriem staan is wat Pieter gebou het en verander het. Ons staan hier op die ou witpad, die oorspronklike pad wat tussen die plase geloop het. Kom na Nelspoortjie, dan sal ek julle die geskiedenis vertel tot nou toe.
In my grandfather's time, this was Nelspoortjie farm, and next door to the south was the farm belonging to Charlie Murray, his great friend. Well, Charlie Murray sold his farm when they discovered a large deposit of copper there, and a township was established during the time that the mine was in place, and it was the construction was all prefabricated houses. The miners and their families lived in prefabricated houses, and when the mine closed, the owners of this farm went and purchased one of the houses and re-erected it here. So this is a prefabricated house on Nelspoortjie farm. The current owners live in this house, and you can see the prefabricated construction. So this house comes from Copperton. The turning of the present tar road to Copperton on the farm that used to be Charlie Murray. And then if you just look at the further sign, it's now a test range for armaments, missiles, tanks, artillery. All of these things are being tested at the Alkantpan test range, which is near the old Copperton mine. It was interesting to listen to Peter talk about the guests that come and stay with him, because most of the people who come to test weapons here, including people from Iraq and Saudi Arabia, many of the Arab countries, people who come and do the weapons testing stay with him, stay on the guest farm. And so he gets to talk to them. Very interesting stuff that's happening out here in the middle of the Karoo that not many of us know about. On the 1st of March 1924, Piet married Cornelia Mabel Dreyer. Now, Corrie was the 11th child. She was born in 1893, and her parents were Hendrik Cornelius Dreyer and Engela Jacoba Blankenberg. Now, Hendrik, on his death certificate, he stated as having been a wheat farmer in the Philadelphia district. He lived on a farm called Driefontein, and if you follow the map now, if you look up where that Driefontein farm was originally, it's now, of course, all built up, but it's not far from the Atlantis diesel engine facility. So it's near the Atlantis Industrial Park, just to the east of it. So that was where she was born, and that's where they lived when she was small. Unfortunately, her father died when she was only 8 years old. And at some point after that, it would appear that the family moved to Cape Town, because when Corrie gets married, she gets married from Cape Town. And her mother, who died in, I think, 1932, I mean, she was she was an old lady by then. Her mother died, and her address was given as Plumstead. The first child of Piet and Corrie was Peggy, born on the 1st of April 1925. Her given name on her baptism certificate is Marguerite Cilliers. And then their second child, Peter, was born on the 29th of November 1926. His given name was after his father, Petrus Stephanus. The two children would have started school in Prieska, and at some point Peggy was sent to school in Queenstown, to girls' high school in Queenstown. It's quite likely that she will have boarded with her uncle Vivian, because Vivian lived in Queenstown before he moved to East London. But both the children completed their schooling in Port Elizabeth, Peggy at Collegiate and Peter at Grey. Peggy, when she left school, studied to become an architect, and Peter joined the Air Force. Peter saw service in the Korean War, and I remember one day him showing me the wound just below his knee, where he had been, while he was flying, he had been struck by some bit of metal. He was fired upon, and he was wounded during that war. And then, when he returned to South Africa, he spent his whole career in the Air Force, and he retired with the rank of brigadier. Nelspoortjie farm was a fairly large farm, something like 8 or 9,000 morgen, and Piet was a highly successful wool farmer. In 1934, he erected a shearing shed, a new shearing shed for himself, and that building still stands today. The current owner has changed the use of the building. It's no longer a shearing shed. It's now been converted into guest units. And so I had the privilege of sleeping in one of those units when I visited the farm. And so I was sleeping in Oupa Piet's shearing shed. And in some of the video material, you'll see that outside of that building still remain the sheep kraal and the old wool loading ramp. Those are all still in place.
This is where Oupa Piet would also have had his sheep kraals. You will notice that there's some stone packing here topped with brickwork. I think that all dates from the time when my grandfather farmed here. And then this bit of metalwork in front of me is actually the bed of a lorry, an old lorry, which has been simply placed in position here for the loading of wool bales. I'll walk you around and show you. If you come to this side of it, you'll see that it's actually, this is the back end of an old lorry from the 1930s. And there the sheep kraals beyond, and this would have been the wool shed, the shearing shed. This, what has been changed into guest rooms now, this was originally the shearing shed, and this is where the wool bales would have been loaded.
In the pictures you'll see some images of the railway bus coming to load wool. Railway buses were very helpful for the farmers in all the rural districts back in the 1930s, and even after that, because they would bring the post, and then they would also bring many parcels that had been ordered, and would take away produce, things like cream cans for delivery to the cheese factory, and then bales of wool. They would then transport the products to the nearest railway station. Piet appears to have been an active participant in community affairs. There's a picture of him serving on the school board. Shortly after both children had left home, very sadly, Corrie contracted cancer. The primary was breast cancer, and then the secondary, this all was contained in her death certificate. Secondary was cancer of the spine. And so in around about 1947 or 48, the farm was sold, and the family moved to Cape Town so that she could be nearer hospitals for treatment. Very sadly, though, she died in 1949. In one of the earlier months of 1949, she died. And then Piet's brother Harold, who was my grandfather, Piet's brother Harold had died in 1941 in an airplane crash, and his widow was Violet. And so it was a marriage between Peter and Violet, and he was marrying his brother's wife. And so then Peter, was grandfather to the children of Peggy and the children of Peter, and he was step-grandfather to all of the other children involved, the Curries and the Hobsons. Peter grew up in an uncertain time, and his need for being armed to ward off bad types or people who might want to steal stuff from him. It was borne out by the fact that he used to carry a revolver with him. And as a teenager, I remember one day this revolver was extracted from its little cubby in the dash of his car, and I was given a toothbrush and some paraffin and told to thoroughly scrub this weapon. And when he traveled, he used to travel with a defense weapon with him. And his words to us were, "I shoot first and I ask questions after." Peter was a very skilled handyman, particularly a woodworker, and he made various items of furniture, one of which was a small table and 2 chairs made of stinkwood, which was for myself and my sister Mary, and which we used when we were little. That table and chairs at some point was used by our daughter Heather, and there's a still picture of 2 of her children seated at the table and using it, and it has now been passed further along down the line, and it is due to be used by Craig and Sam Smith. I hope you have enjoyed the video of Piet Cilliers and his life on Nelspoortjie farm. It was wonderful for me to travel up to Briska and to go and stay on the farm and to actually see all the places. And so for those who actually remember Piet, who met him, I hope that you have enjoyed seeing again pictures of where he lived, and that you could share some of my interest and enjoyment in going to go and see that part of the world, and also then to have an account, I suppose, of what it was like on a Karoo farm back in the 1910s and the 1920s and the 1930s. So although this is not a strictly Graaff-Reinet story, I have included it in the Stoep Stories channel, so because I felt that there were enough connections to the people of Graaff-Reinet. As to the actual Jackal stories themselves, I'm afraid I don't remember the details of them clearly enough to actually retell any of the stories, but we as grandchildren do remember with a great deal of fondness sitting around his chair in the lounge while he would recount to us these stories. So that concludes the story about Piet and Nelspoortjie farm. But before we end off, I'm just going to include one last story about Oupa Piet and his glass eye. Oupa Piet Cilliers lost his right eye in a pellet gun accident when he was quite a young boy. And so he spent almost his whole life with a glass eye. And this led to an amusing incident, because one day on Nelspoortjie farm, Oupa Piet was busy in the shearing shed. They were busy shearing sheep. And somebody arrived on the farm, and Oupa Piet was necessary for him to accompany this person out away from the shearing shed to some other point on the farm. And so before he left the shearing shed, he made quite a big thing of taking out his glass eye and putting it on top of a cupboard and saying to those who were working in the shed, "I'm leaving my eye here to observe you. Make sure that you work properly." Anyway, he went off. They were away for about half an hour. And when Oupa Piet got back to the shearing shed, he walked in and he saw that his eye had been covered. On top of the cupboard, the eye had a hat placed over it.